Welcome everyone to the Brooklyn Rail's 184th New Social Environment. My name is Catherine Olson. I'm the Director of Advertising at the Rail, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation between Jordan Casteel and Ashley James. We're also thrilled to have the poet Asiya Wadud here, who will read to close today's program. To begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail also recognizes the illegal annexation of the Republic of Artsakh as a grave international injustice. We stand in support of the Armenian people and the global Armenian diaspora. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprising in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashard Brooks, Raya Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country. We acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation, demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our host, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Our guest today, Jordan Casteel, has rooted her practice in community engagement, painting from her own photographs of people she encounters. Her nearly life-size portraits and cropped compositions chronicle personal observations of the human experience. Her solo exhibition titled Within Reach is currently on view at the New Museum. Our host, Ashley James, joined the curatorial department of the Guggenheim in 2019. Her work merges curatorial practice with an academic background rooted in African American studies, English literature, and women's gender and sexuality studies. James holds a BA from Columbia and a PhD from Yale. Without further ado, Ashley, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail and the Hill Art Foundation for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with Jordan Casteel today, a painter in person of great humanity. And in kind of conceptualizing this conversation, when we spoke last week, I think perhaps naturally we reminded ourselves that we met while the both of us were in graduate school, I for much longer. And we thought that that provided an even greater reasoning for thinking about this conversation as a look back and seeing how your practice has evolved in the last few years, beginning with that graduate school moment. So let me share my screen. So Jordan, let's start in 2014. Which is actually not that long ago. I mean, it was 6 years ago, but it feels like a long time. So much has happened, and it's been really amazing to see your development as a painter. I want to begin here and kind of get a sense of what you were thinking at this point in your painting career. This is where you began your Visible Man series, though I'm curious to know at what point you decided that that was a series in its own. So can you just talk a little bit about the origination of the Visible Man series, which finds you painting close friends, family, and yeah, what the conceptual basis of that for you was?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, Ashley, we talked about last week and kind of since this has been developing, how long overdue this is. So thank you for joining me in this, and everyone at the Hill Art Foundation and the Brooklyn Rail for bringing us together, because I think this is a pretty special opportunity for us to kind of look back and have a dialogue about the development since knowing of each other. You're right, 6 years is not that long ago. I feel like this year has been a real play on time because I never know like if it's been 3 days or like 3 hours right now. Like everything's become a blur. But in many ways, the past 6 years feels similarly. Like the time since graduate school and the conception of this work was the beginning of something that I could have never imagined. I just had a very intense clarity at this time that as I was transitioning from my first year into my second year, anticipating a thesis exhibition where I was going to kind of present a culminating project that says, here are the things that I have learned in my 2 years at Yale, and say, I plan to go into the world with this kind of energy. And I had spent the first year kind of dilly-daddling in self-portraiture or still lifes and making portraits of friends and classmates, but I didn't feel that I had a very clear sense of direction. As somebody who studied sociology and anthropology for much of my life and someone who loves to read and engage in kind of critical analysis of our world and environments and how structures have influenced us all, there were things that I was thinking about all the time, but I hadn't found the way to seamlessly bring that into my art practice. They were very disconnected at the time. It was like me as a like theorist or kind of an engager of my community and thinking critically about the things that are happening around me. And then like me as a painter in grad school, just like trying to figure out how to survive every day with a paintbrush in my hands. You know, like how do I survive the next critique was as big as my world was getting at that time. But I saw these nudes as an entry point, as really a defining point for myself around the things that I care about and the things that I am thinking about, and trying to marry my love for social justice and my love for paint and color into the same sphere. And that's what happened with these nudes. I was thinking really critically about how I could contribute a language or a dialogue to the world that may or may not be already occurring. How do I elevate the people that I love and present them in a way that they might not see otherwise, and use this medium of paint that after a year of trying to do other things, I learned quite quickly that I was a painter's painter. My classmates all agreed. It was like, nah, you know what, Jordan, you tried these other things, maybe you should stick to painting. And I was like, great, that's how I feel. So I'm glad we're all in agreement that my language is paint and painting and color. And so once I stepped into that fully, it felt like an opportunity to use the medium to say something or to draw something out of people that I wasn't necessarily seeing elsewhere. And that was about Black masculinity and humanity and my relationship to it from the outside, but also from the inside, and having siblings or family members or friends really who were kind of living in the double consciousness, like the state of sort of knowing what it is that their life means externally and then what their life means internally, and the conflict of those two things. And I wanted to bring the humanity of those people to the forefront. So I figured, you know, if I'm already gone so far as to making it into Yale, and this experience as being one that I never imagined for myself, then I might as well really dive into the deep end. And asking the subjects to pose nude was the way that I saw best fit the proposal at hand in my mind.
Great. Yeah, I wanted to, that dovetails quite nicely to my next question around your relationship to the nude body, which of course carries its own history and its own question of, you know, viewer, subject, sitter, painter ethics, the stakes of that environment, the intimacy of the act. What did, especially looking back now and seeing this as not a one-off, but quite a singular approach to your portraiture, if we take where the work went after this series. So kind of looking back at that moment, I'm curious to know how you navigated kind of the ethics of the nude as such, in a maybe like a theoretical level, but also just like practically, what was it? Did you kind of just say to your friends, like, I want this project to happen?
Yeah.
Are you cool with it? Of course, like they're actors and stuff, so this is completely up their alley, but yeah, could you talk about the moment and kind of higher level theoretically?
Yeah, there was this moment of reckoning that occurred for me in the studio, and it was based around conversations I was having with critics or people who were observing the work as it was developing, where people were blocked by the clothing. They weren't having a conversation about vulnerability and intimacy. And that was the game plan. That was the thing that I wanted people to talk about. And what I was observing is that they were talking about something else. So the decision to present the Black male body nude was a very intentional one. I knew that if I was going to make this work, that everything had to be done with a very intense amount of clarity and determination and research and respect and care that I felt that historically hadn't been offered, especially in the world of painting, offered to the Black male body, and especially just in the world in general. But I really wanted to be tender. I wanted to research as much as possible. So what I did was, like, Black Male, the exhibition catalog that Thelma Golden did, was one of the Bibles that I leaned heavily on during that time, reading essays and thinking about what this would mean to these people, real people. I think that's like the real kicker that sometimes people forget in the context of my practice, is that every person that I have painted are real, living, breathing souls in this world who have affected me in some capacity or entered my world through painting. And I feel a sense of responsibility as a result to make sure that whatever decisions I'm making on the onset around how I represent them is going to be something that they will be proud of and comfortable with, as I will be proud of and comfortable with from here on out. The second it leaves my studio, it's like game over. I can control things to an extent, but there's a lot that I can't control, but I'm going to imbue within them as much respect as possible. And some of the decisions I was making around not having their genitalia be on the forefront, the scale, the color, the way that this is of Atu, but there's a painting of Yaya where his feet are kind of pressing up against the edges of the canvas, that I wanted them to feel as if they could step out of the canvas and into our physical realm and be present in the conversations that we were having about them. Their direct and intense gaze, that there was going to be no way that people could deny their livelihood or their existence wherever they went. They were going to command a certain amount of attention. So I had done this call out to various communities at Yale, asking people to participate in this project. And I'm sure what I should do is dig through my emails and find that initial email, because it might be horrifying. I thought I put the language all together to make it seem like it made sense. Like, I am an artist in the Yale School of Art and I'm doing this project. And the majority of people said no at first, because the majority of people they had reached out to were people who were planning professional careers and didn't want images of themselves existing in this capacity. But once I went to the drama school, it was a wrap. They were all like, oh, sure, whatever, where do you need me? Which was a jarring experience for me as well, because I do consider myself to be slightly more introverted, and it required me to trust them as much as they were trusting me, because I was going into all of their homes by myself without knowing them mostly beforehand, and asking them to take me to their most intimate spaces. So they were kind of curating for themselves in advance what it was that they wanted and where they wanted to be.
Yeah, that I'm just wondering, when you're speaking of how the process affected you, do you find that you have become a more extroverted person in the process of your portraiture, or how have you changed? This is kind of my one-off question.
Yeah, no, this is great. I think, no one's ever asked me that. So now I'm like, how have I changed? I think that it has brought and forced me, as sort of intentionally perhaps, to look up and not be so focused on what it is that I am trying to do in any given day. By nature, I am a deeply empathetic and feeling oriented person. So I've always been a sensor of the people around me, and their energy can affect me in various capacities. But I think that the greatest change, was that I do have to force myself out of my own head by doing this work. I have to force myself out of any preconceived notions about whether or not people are going to accept me or not. Because I'm often surprised by people's willingness to say, yeah, come into my world. I would love to welcome you here. Have a seat. Would you like some water? What is your story? And that's just as important. It is about a relationship between me and the people that I'm painting. And so even as I was making those nudes, and frequently people would say things like, you know, when are you going to paint women? It feels very like, it's interesting that you're making the female gaze explicitly on the male body. And yes, that was all true. And yes, as a heterosexual identifying woman, I recognized that desire was going to be a part of the conversation, that I had to be distinctively aware of what desire meant in relation to making these paintings, but it was about a collaboration. And so I see so much of myself in these paintings that it's hard for me to feel that the feminine or the gender is, I have a hard time seeing gender as being so linearly tied to what people perceive exists within these paintings, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hearing you speak about the gender dynamics, obviously the racial component, the gaze, ethics of the maker. It also, I mean, this conversation is so much about the history of photography. And obviously like Mapplethorpe comes to mind. And it's interesting how painting in some ways like gets you out of that impasse. And I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm just like riffing here, but it's something about representation of skin and the question of like the natural or something. But yeah.
I think it has to do with like the physical gesture of making a painting as well. That I'm literally using the material in my hands to be in dialogue and to be in concert really with and playing and responding. It's like a call and response between them and myself as I'm looking at the image and using that as reference. That it doesn't stop there, that there's every brushstroke is me going back and memorizing and remembering the folds of someone's arm or the skin or the light and their energy within a certain space, and kind of reconciling my relationship to that, and telling that story kind of through that. And so that's like photography. I totally agree that there's something tied within it. But that's for me where the difference kind of lies in my experience of making it, at least, is the time that it offers, which is very different than a photograph.
Right. And it's from the photograph that the painting becomes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Sorry, my studio neighbor's dog.
Yeah, the quarantine dogs.
Yeah, they just got another puppy too, so it's like double as that.
Chorus.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So then, you graduate from Yale. Shortly thereafter, you're at the Studio Museum, Artist in Residence program, and there you begin to engage with a new community. Just in a literal way, you've moved away from New Haven, but of course your practice shifts as well. And I'm interested in what the shift to the outdoors as a kind of contrast to the interior space offered you in terms of building upon this larger project of representation and a more comprehensive, full version of a Black masculinity, thinking specifically about how the interior obviously has its own kind of psychological terrain and carries forth certain ideas of the interiority of the subject and so forth. So yeah, what did Harlem break open for you really? Once you
safety and home in New York City. That, like, it was unbelievable how difficult it was. I was shocked by how difficult it was for me being a Colorado girl, like who had gone to college in Atlanta and spent time in New Haven, and I have an aunt who lives on the Upper West Side. So I was like, yeah, I know New York. I got this, no problem. Everybody's going there, so I'm just gonna follow suit. And then I got here and was like, oh God, I like can barely see the sun beyond the clouds. Like I just was so overwhelmed by the density of the population. I was having a really hard time finding myself within such a vast world of selves and energies. And it was in Harlem that I really felt a sigh occur within my body. I felt a certain release of tension. I felt safe. I felt like there was a familiarity that explicitly came from my time at the Studio Museum, without a doubt, that being able to walk into an institution every day, where from the moment that I'm seeing somebody at the front door, whether it's somebody who works in security or front desk, up into the elevators to the second floor, the third floor, the fourth, like I felt safe and seen there, no matter how I felt. I was embraced in what I thought were silly questions. And it did allow me to feel comfortable exploring the street as a model of inhabiting space intimately, even if it is externally from our intimate spaces. So, for example, being in New York, I think most of us would say our homes are like very important because it is a sanctuary. And that sanctuary was the thing that I was trying to tap into in graduate school. I wanted to see what people had on their mantles. I wanted to see the objects and the way that they set up safety for themselves within a kind of certain parameter or box. And what I found in Harlem is that the way that people occupied the street was very similar. I felt it immediately. I would see the same people consistently in the same place. The way that they curated the spaces that they occupied on the street were very distinct, were very intentional, purposeful. And I was just observing that. And in that observation, I remember having a conversation with Amanda Hunt, who was kind of our curator lead at the time, along with Hallie Ringel. And Amanda, I said, is it silly to like want to paint people in heart? Like that feels so obvious. And she was like, no, and sometimes it is the thing that is the most obvious that you need to pursue. And there's a reason it feels obvious. And it felt too explicit. Like like as an artist, like I needed to like uncover something. But the reality is I was uncovering my own sense of self and place in Harlem and the relationships that I was building and trying to set up roots for myself here in New York. And it felt like a very natural transition from kind of these interior paintings that I had been making at Yale to exterior paintings that occupied exterior or interior kind of energies that I was already connected to. That I like the idea that there are people that we walk by that, similar to us feeling welcomed into their home, have stories to tell, and all you have to do is say hello to get access to that. Because that sort of was my experience. Is the second I stopped and introduced myself to those people I would frequently pass by on the street, I got to know who they were. I suddenly was in their home, in their minds, and knowing their story. And that was a very treasured moment for me that I wanted to capture through the act of painting and share. I think this painting of Jared that you have up on the screen is kind of a perfect example of me looking out onto the street. So behind it is the building that was the Studio Museum in Harlem. They're under construction. So it's weird now because the building has kind of come down, but there's the studios that are right above the David Hammons flag in the background. And I would just like sit there and watch. There's just this gentle hum of drums and energy that you're always drawn into, even when you're inside in Harlem, especially on 125th Street. And one day I was looking out my perch and I saw this young man skateboarding, clearly just in his own world and mind. And something told me to go introduce myself and say hi and see if he'd be willing to pose. And so this is Jared doing exactly that. And I love kind of the memory that this painting holds as a result of that moment, really.
Yeah, I love Jared and his skateboard.
Yeah, I know.
Especially because it really foregrounds, like, because what you're saying about public space, which is so important, the public, how personal the public becomes when you're in a city context where you have to kind of find space outside of the confines of the apartment building.
And the things we carry and wear are the way that we connect to those intimacies. So like the hacky sack on his knee and the hemps, like that's his t-shirt brand. And he has a stone around his neck similar to me. And, those are the things that then allow us to connect to him as a person outside of the environment or within the environment.
Definitely. And part of what communicates that or allows for that kind of connection to Jared as a person is the pose as well. And I'm curious about posing on the street because it does seem that from the shift to the interior to the public space, it even relies more heavily in some ways on how these men are sitting, how they're comporting themselves in these spaces. And if you could talk a little bit about that negotiation, like what was the process like of talking with your various subjects about how you wanted them to appear? How many photographs do you take? Like, how are those decisions made?
Yeah, the bare bones is I am no photographer at all. And especially now that I am engaged to a photographer, I have learned the hard way and maybe the good way that like I just gotta stay in my lane. Like he has amplified the fact that I now print on semi-gloss paper, which does actually make you see more detail. Like I fought that for a really long time. But I'm a person who is I enjoy consistency, and I'm a person of habit in a certain way. And the way that I would engage people from time at Yale to now, the way that the engagement happens is a simple introduction with my camera in hand, where I might take up to 100 photographs, where I'm not thinking about like a singular photograph as being representative of that moment. I'm thinking about documenting. I could very well take a video and take screen grabs from that video and get the same kind of effect that I'm seeking. And that's the fluidity of capturing a moment so that it can be representative and a reference for me in the studio. If that's all it is in my mind and heart, is that it is reference for me to return back to. But as they're posing themselves or sitting in space, I'm maybe conscious of the canvas and the structure of a canvas. And if his leg is all of a sudden shot out really far into the frame, then I would maybe say something like, oh, do you mind tucking that leg in? Because I'm thinking about the canvas. But 90% of the time, in the way that the kind of body is engaged is on their own accord. They're making those decisions for themselves. Mm-hmm. He suggested, if I recall correctly, he was like, is it cool if I sit on my skateboard? Yeah, like, let's do that. So it's a very kind of fluid conversation where I'm saying also, like, you'll get these photographs after. That's one of the exchanges that we're making, is that I'm like, yeah, here, you're going to have all these photographs. I'll be basically your photographer for a period of time, and then you'll have these images to do what you want with, but I'm just using it as reference for this painting that I'm going to make. And then within the painting, I might pull objects or pieces of various images together to build the composition as a whole. And so I don't see it as a one-to-one relationship in any way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That relationship between the photograph and the painting, and what you're saying about this kind of like pastiche brings me to my next question about the retreat from you told this line between really striking realism, this ability to capture a subject's likeness, but also never fully going that route of the documentary in painting, and keeping it in this kind of space of the surreal, the hyperreal. Marcus and Jace, I think, is a great example of that, in this kind of hyper red, pigmented. It feels like I can't tell what time of day it is, though the light tells me something, and the red seems to be communicating something about the building space that lies outside of the actual representation of the wall, floor, etc. It's like, again, this kind of like psychological space. And I am careful about this question because I never want to get into a painter's secrets around how they construct their works. But I am interested, especially because I'm thinking back to the nudes and the way that you work through kind of spectrum of color in terms of skin pigmentation. How do you, when are these decisions made, specifically around color, and how you almost want a painting to emanate? Like, at what point do you decide this individual is going to be kind of blue tinted, this individual is going to have the red overtone? are those conscious decisions for you, and where are they? Obviously conscious, but are they more systematic, or where are those decisions made?
I loved the fact that you use the word surrealism. I haven't necessarily used that myself, nor have I heard it in relation to my practice. But the second you said it, I feel deeply connected to it, because I think the thing that is happening in surrealism that is identified and talked about historically and presently is the notion of kind of presenting the world as you imagine it, that there's room for kind of distortion and flexibility that is oftentimes not related to portraiture quite explicitly in the way that I've been doing it, with a seated figure kind of in a recognizable environment or relationship to the body. And I am making very distinct choices around color quite early on in the process. The room that Marcus was sitting in was, like, in actuality, this barbershop is beige, and in no way has all these red hues to it. The chairs that they're seated on are that maroon color, and they have been that maroon color for as long as I can remember going to that barbershop with my mom. Like, my own personal memory of that space holds this like dusty maroon chair that I sort of thought was comfortable, but like isn't that comfortable, but I spent a lot of time on. But at the same time, there's a warmth to Marcus and who he is as a person that I wanted to tap into. So oftentimes the color decisions are happening very early on. I'm making the color decisions before I even touch paint, before I even sketch on the canvas. I have my reference image and I have color aids, which are just like very expensive paint chips, and I throw them all over the floor and I begin to just pick up and play. It is one of the most playful aspects of my practice, I think, because I allow myself to make decisions quite quickly, and then I try as hard as I can not to second guess those decisions from the beginning. And some of those practices come from my own love of painting from life. The thing that I enjoyed in graduate school in particular, when I had a subject right in front of me and a certain time frame and a canvas, and I was trying to represent something, is I didn't have time to think, that I really had to allow my hands to do what it does best and let my heart and soul tell the story as I see fit. And so I try to create all these structures, as structured as I am with the paintings, that I try to create freedom for myself within those confines to kind of release any expectations around what this space actually is versus what this space could be and what I want it to be. And that red was, I recall picking up that color and saying, this feels right. Why? I have no idea. But then building the rest of the composition around it and thinking about how the colors will relate to that red and making decisions about, I loved how graphic and bold the pennants were in the background. I added my own pennant from Yale, that Yale one in the corner, because he didn't have that, although I had given it to him, he hadn't hung it up yet. And I was all salty with him that day. It was like, where's my Yale one? He was like, I got it, Jordan, I'll do it. But I added it in the painting kind of jokingly, but I love that there could be a sense of play for me. That's where my enjoyment comes. I've always been that way for as long as I can remember, that color is an integral part. And I try not to think about it too much. I like the fact that I can kind of re-identify for the viewer a sense of feeling to a space and environment that might not have been there otherwise, or if they were there themselves.
Yeah, that's great. And I feel like that definitely comes through. And I love the idea of, like, how do you communicate a warmth?
Yeah. And sometimes things happen so the painting of Miles and Jojo is a painting where they're blue. And when I made that painting, I wasn't super conscious of that decision. But when I asked my nephew about it, who is Jojo and represented in it, sorry, I gave you all the wrong images, right? Now I'm talking about ones that aren't even up here. But the Miles and Jojo one, they're blue, and he was like, why do I look sad? And I was like, oh, like I hadn't necessarily connected to that sense of sadness, but as a young mind, that is what he felt, which might have some truth to it, that there's always kind of things that I discover about my color choices afterwards, and why I made certain decisions at a certain time, that I might not have made intentionally initially.
Yeah, do you feel like, we can use Patrick and Omari as an example in this case. Do you see the blue tonation as representative of the personalities of these men, or where did that come from?
I think it came from the way that the sun was setting that day. Actually, I know that's right. There was a coolness on the opposite end from warmth. I remember there was a general, like it's like that summer sunset in Brooklyn, New York, where the sun is kind of reflecting off of buildings and creating these shadows that feel cool in juxtaposition to the warmth of the sky. And I remember thinking about, like, there's that yellow behind them and that warmth kind of drawing them in behind, but having them kind of feel as a part of that shadow space. But I didn't want them, I was thinking about representing their skin as purpley, but their father and son, I didn't want it to be exacting in the shades of purple that I used. So Omari, who is wearing the white shirt, he's slightly more blue than his dad, who has a little bit more red undertones in it. So I wanted them to feel familial without being the same, figuring out how for the viewer can engage and see their relationship through color, but also see their differences and how they're posturing. I think says a lot. The way that Omari is holding his hands between his legs and his shoulders are kind of hunched in what feels to me as a protective kind of stance, and his dad's leaned back with his arm out and like yeah, okay, like I know who I, my hand, that hand across his leg is being open. There's an openness versus a closedness of their bodies, and I wanted to kind of highlight those relationships.
Yeah, that's great, Jordan. I love how much different kind of work color can do. Like in this instance, as a marker of time and that specific moment for you.
Absolutely.
Which is really beautiful. Another example. So, of course, you are a figurative painter, and that is the centrality of your practice, the larger discourse of representation. I love Memorial because it takes us out of that briefly and brings us to the still life, the cityscape. Could you talk a bit about what brought along Memorial? Like what compelled you to make this break towards?
Yeah, I think especially during the time that I produced this body of work at the Studio Museum in Harlem as a part of my kind of culminating show there as a resident. And I was still living and still do live in Harlem. And oftentimes as I move through space in general, I think I'm observing in the way probably many of us are the objects within the spaces that we occupy. And this object in particular stopped me sort of in my tracks. I remember it was kind of late at night. I was walking alone home, and I saw this discarded memorial flower arrangement by the trash can. There was, or is, I think there's a funeral home or a church kind of nearby on the block that I saw this. But I remember just being like, it's crazy that you would just put it on the street. Like when it's done, when you've used it, when you have mourned this life, that it gets put on the street for all of us to participate in some ways in the memory of someone that we do or don't know. And I think that space and still life and objects have always kind of held some of that for me in the paintings, whether there's a person or not. The environments have become more expansive. I think I've become more interested in thinking about where it is that people are occupying space and how our life exists within that. And sometimes that exists, like to me, this feels very figurative, even if it's not a fully encompassing like representation of a figure, that the memory of the figure, that the experience of the figure, that the experience of a life lived and lost is so explicitly present for me in this painting that I took the photograph on my cell phone and actually had it in my studio for almost a year before I actually decided to paint it. I think as many artists, particularly as me as a young painter, identifying what is or isn't a part of my practice and So as I moved from painting Black male nudes, it was like Jordan Casteel who paints Black male nudes. And I was like, wait, like I'm 28, like I don't want to be Jordan Casteel does anything other than Jordan Casteel the painter. Then, you know, exploring and going outside, that I've always thought of the practice as needing and deserving a certain fluidity that every artist wants and craves, that every creative, every maker, everybody who is engaged in creative thinking in any capacity, we're always seeking expansiveness, that the practice is expansive. The practice does include moments such as these, and these are equally as important as a full seated frontal portrait that we have kind of accepted in the linear art historical language. You know, like it's like, okay, this bitch, she's a painter, she paints people. But when I made this painting, it was kind of like, where does this go? And I'm like, right here in the middle. It goes in the middle. It is a part of this sentence, this story that I'm writing. I see it as a document of almost like a memoir of sorts on these paintings, and that every chapter, every page, every turn, every comma, every word contributes to a larger narrative. And this is a part of that for me, that it is an anchor in the rest of the sentence. So for that, it deserves, and I feel connected to it as intimately as I do any of the other paintings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's well taken, and the fact of the memorial bouquet as literally being tied to a life makes that even more clear. It also makes me think the retreat of the figure, if you want to call that, you know, not even a retreat so much as off view, because it's like the person's 2 steps next to the frame of this painting, especially in the city when streets are never fully evacuated.
Never. Totally.
But it does make me think about larger discourse of visibility of the subject, visibility of the Black subject. And, you know, obviously you have been in conversation with the question of visibility from the Visible Man series. Wondering just your thoughts about that in terms of a discourse that would have that there's danger in the visibility of the subject at the same time as there's possibility. Where do you fit within that larger conversation?
That's an interesting and important question, I think, and how, particularly as Black and brown bodies are being represented and being in Harlem, right? Like probably in that immediate moment that I saw this, I connected a Black or brown body to this memorial arrangement, but it could very easily be somewhere. I don't know. There are people outside of what I see the most in Harlem who live and die within this space. And so I think it all ties back to the way that we construct narratives around the people who inhabit the spaces like near us. So through media or through hyper representation in one way or another, we're constructing constantly narratives of who these people are and what their community looks like, whether it's an assumption of something being discarded. Maybe this wasn't discarded,
right.
You know, maybe it's more intentionally put. Maybe it was a sculptural decision where somebody wanted people to engage within this way. It's hard telling what the intention behind that placement was. And I think it's very similar when thinking about the lives and the people that I'm choosing to represent, and the complexity of the narratives that exist and the layers that have to be discovered that take time, right? It takes time for me as a painter to try to understand those things for myself. And I can only scratch so much of the surface to create a certain perspective for others to see something they might not have seen before. But to create visibility and invisibility are still in conversation no matter what. As I felt, as I was specifically representing Black men for a period of time, I found myself feeling rendered invisible through the narratives others were creating around that work. That it was Jordan Casteel paints X, Y, and Z next, you know, like it was like, it didn't allow me the full scope of my existence and my experience and what it means to make these paintings, that even my recognizing memorial, this is my painting of it and my experience of it, that again, it comes back to the gestures. I see so much myself within it. But I am behind the scenes, and I've sort of made the decision to turn my own personal lens outwards, even if I am still representative within it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a delicate balance. I am particularly interested in sort of the mundaneness of our existence, that which is kind of disregarded or moved beyond more quickly than other moments. That if I'm standing on a pedestal and speaking, that people deem that Jordan Casteel is important because she's on a pedestal speaking. But if I'm at home crying on my couch, is that because other people aren't having access to that, does that disregard or take away from some of the importance that other people place on my body, or the bodies of those that I love? So kind of creating an exposure without, and recognizing that I in no way can overly expose, or all of this is transcribed through my lens. And that is a very unique and singular lens. And the way that people experience the work and the people who are represented in it speak of the work for themselves is oftentimes different than what I saw on my own. So it's just a reminder. I think this practice serves for me a constant reminder of the need to kind of take time, that time takes time literally to get to know people, that the process of creating a more equal and awakened space is just going to require creating as many representations and opportunities for people to engage with those representations as possible. So my representation of people is just a drop in the bucket of the myriad of brilliant things that my community and those around me are doing. But we can all look at the same apple and paint it differently. And that's what I love, is that we're all going to see something differently in the end.
I love that, Jordan. I feel like that articulates these different scales of time that seem so important. There's the time that you take to get to know someone, the time that's the engagement of even the initial documentation, you painting, obviously, but then the different time scale that is recognizing that it goes out into the world and that it's going to be engaged by any number of people for an indeterminate amount of time, and kind of accepting that as key. Okay, we are moving along here in time, so let me try to wrap up before questions. Let's see. I wanted to ask you about a more recent work where you've returned to the interior and still working with Black men, and between this time you also painted women as well, and I'll get to a question with that in a second. But I'm just curious, in making this work, I guess 5-6 years after the Visible Man series, if your relationship to the practice changed, entering someone's space, the larger discourse of Black masculinity, or did it feel like a kind of return to that initial body of work?
Yeah, I think it's both and. In some ways it felt like a return because, like you said, going back into people's homes, the difference being in some ways that I had relationships with all of these subjects before I went to their homes, whereas the Visible Man, I didn't necessarily have relationships with them before I entered their homes. So these were a lot of these paintings, they were featured at Casey Kaplan Gallery as a part of a show, The Practice of Freedom, thinking explicitly about my relationship to teaching and my relationship to my students. And again, it's kind of thinking about creating a visible line for people to knowing something they might not know otherwise. So I often talk about my students. I'm deeply engaged in my practice of being an educator, but no one really had direct access to knowing them in the way that I did, nor did I fully understand that I too didn't have direct access to knowing them in the way that this project allowed me to see. So for example, we exist in the classroom space, well, pre-COVID, we had a classroom, they'd come there every day, we'd paint, we'd work together, then they would leave. I only knew what happened within the confines of that space for a period of time that we shared. But this allowed me to go into their homes and to meet their family and to see what it looks like when they return or leave my classroom and go into their own kind of habitat. And so I felt a certain confidence with the people that I was representing, but I also felt a similar to the time I was going into other people's homes, where my eyes were just wide as I was taking in the environments that I was trying to absorb, the things that they love, the thing that their mom kept saying that, you know, they love this, and then them being like, no, I don't, whatever it might be, how they navigate that space in those moments. And I think there's also a confidence. So it was a return in that, the difference being that there's a confidence that I have developed since making that body of work at Yale, where in the paint handling, in the way that I'm representing the body, the choice to kind of keep clothes engaged and wanting that to be a part of the process at this point, and not feeling that that's going to block people from seeing them, feeling confident that no matter how I represent them, whoever is being represented I'm going to give them as much respect as, like, that respect is going to be there. And that's a trust within myself, and that I think I'm starting to build a certain confidence around. So I think that was the biggest kind of shift for me, is making these works. They're a little bit bigger. Well, they're kind of a lot a bit bigger. I thought they were really big when I was making those nudes, and then I made these and saw them all at the new museum and was like, all of a sudden the paintings I thought were huge are not that big. Like I've become more interested in the environments. That's what I mean about like spreading out over time. Like I have found myself wanting to give more literal real estate to the environments that the bodies or the people are occupying, because I do think that they lend themselves greatly to telling the story that I'm trying to tell as well. In the way that my gesture of the brushstroke at the bottom near his shoe, and letting those be more expressive and more expansive gestures, as opposed to kind of a tightness that I had during my time at Yale. That I think I was very afraid that I was undeserving of this opportunity, of the opportunity of being at Yale. And now I think I'm starting to fall into a place of being like, you know what, whether I'm deserving or not doesn't matter. I just want to do this painting justice in this moment. I want to be free. So there's a freedom that I think has occurred that's slightly different than some of those earlier works.
I love that, Jordan. It's so interesting. It's like you had to leave New Haven, which likely story, heard it time and time again, but literally going out into public space, like breaking open the environment to be able to come back into the interior and see it with the complexity that you do.
And to be in an academic environment, I mean, there's no question that my reading or the intentionality, but it was like, I wasn't going to be a person amongst my peers, one of the few people of color painting brown bodies, who didn't have an answer for every question they were going to throw my way. Like, I was going to know. So there was like a very intense intentionality when I made those works, in a way that I've allowed myself to just be a black woman painting black and brown people however I want. Like, that I don't really have to explain myself anymore. I don't feel the need to explain myself, nor do the subjects. I don't want them to feel that anymore.
That's great. I think at the same time, I think the concept there is just still so strong. So it's felt, even if it's like, if the weight has been lifted off of you individually, which is great. And I think I'm going to end here with your recent commission. It's the first time that you ever made a commission for a magazine, I think. Yes. And so, I have a kind of two-part question back to women. And I'm just curious about at what point you decided that you wanted to open up the project again to include women, and also just a more general question of what excites you about the figure still to this day, which is just something that is so well seen in your practice, and in hearing you talk today, like a kind of excitement. We see a work in progress behind you. If you can talk about, you're closing it.
Just come.
We can't see. If you can talk about Aurora as yeah, as kind of concretizing a couple of new things for you.
Yeah, I think that to answer kind of the question about when women appeared, and I think that happened pretty early on after I finished Studio Museum, that I was really thinking about why I haven't and why not, and that if I'm so passionate about feeling myself within the work and the feminine as existing as it relates to myself in the work, then there's no reason to not fully investigate that within the practice. So I think the first kind of, well, and in some ways, you know, I'd always done these self-portraits. So in the way that the world had known me and accepted me, the art world kind of had been contextualizing my practice. I had never felt that I hadn't painted women because I'd done self-portraits. I had painted my mom. I'd painted women before, but in kind of a formal, conceptual, professional manner, I hadn't necessarily returned to that practice until I painted Bay Falls, and Balu was represented within that painting. And I think she was the first kind of woman physically represented in the work. But I've always sort of also, this is a side note, like I've loved the idea that because the genitalia isn't showing, the fact that we place masculinity on their bodies is always in question for me, like how we define those terms around the gender and why that was important. Like I always thought it was curious that people felt the need to gender me and gender the subject so quickly, that it was like her name's Jordan or their name's Jordan, and then they'd be like, oh, I assumed it was a man, and then it was a woman because only a man. Like there are so many layers in the way that we determine gender in the work. So when I kind of clarified for myself that it really has never mattered to me all along explicitly, that I felt so present that like, why not? That I don't want to be singularly identified as, again, Jordan Casteel, who paints men only, and Black masculinity as being the singular conversation. Because for me, it was never just Black masculinity. It was about my relationship to these bodies that I knew and loved and cared for and wanted others to know and love them too. So this commission in particular, I think I have never been one to like commissions or feel connected to commissions in my practice, because oftentimes once somebody says, we want you to do this thing, they're going to have their own notions of what they want it to be like. And they think that they're assuming she's representational enough. And then I lose the surrealist ability to kind of do what I want and make the decisions freely as I do on the floor with my color aids and what have you. So this commission, what made it special and me saying yes, and a huge part, because everyone would have said, like my mother was like, what do you mean you have to think about it when it came to me as an offer? Like, what do you mean you have to think about it? I was like, I have to think about it. There are things that I have to make sure align with my practice. And those things included my ability to choose my own subject. So they came to me and said, you know, we want you to paint the September issue. And I said, great, but I have to be in control of who the subject is that I'm representing. So I chose Aurora James intentionally as somebody who I didn't really know, but had been seeing and following and saw it as an opportunity to bring more light to the work she was doing around the 15% pledge. And then we were on the rooftop, we were joking the day that I shot the reference images, because what Vogue shoot would only have 2 people on set ever in the September issue? Like there's no way that would under any circumstance ever fly, except for this moment where it was just the 2 of us, no hair and makeup. We're like FaceTiming the designer to try to figure out how to hold the dress. Like we couldn't figure out how to put it on. We were like literally scrappy with the whole thing. And it's because I don't really care about the photograph, that I needed the freedom to kind of bring her body into this space in a way that best suited our relationship together in that moment. So we talked about her being on her roof because she liked the idea, like we both agreed that the idea of her being close and tied to the sky. I love the fact that the billowing of the dress kind of mimics for me a sense of clouds or the lusciousness or the voluminous of a cloud, and that her foot is pushing up off of the ground into, even as a shoe designer, that she's shoeless and one of her shoes is off to the side, but that she's pushing off the floor and could kind of very easily ascend into the skies above. And there are the birds, and there were a lot of things that I was thinking about decision-wise that Vogue was not involved in. They said, here's the scale of the crop that will be on on the whatever magazine. See, I don't even know. This is how far I am from like doing, what is that thing? The magazine? Like this is the scale of the magazine. So keep that in mind. But I love the idea that like, I've always been interested in the accessibility of work. And although it was new for me and a lot of ways it was uncomfortable, that it became deeply accessible to the world, to have a painting of mine in their hands for $10, $15 or whatever the magazine costs. So yeah, it was difficult, but it was also an amazing kind of experience. And I do love the body and representing the body, but it all becomes abstract when I'm painting it. Like, it's like not about the body, it's about like these sections of light and shadow. That's all I'm seeing when I'm actually making the painting.
Well, Jordan, this has been amazing. I'll just quickly say that I mean, I love this. I love the sky in this. It's like, and thinking about your trajectory, it seems like the rooftop opened up yet another kind of exterior space for the figure to live in relation. And it's always fresh and new.
I love that.
So thank you, Jordan. I think
thank you.
We are definitely at time. I don't know if we still have time for questions or if we've completely gone over, Catherine.
Yeah, no, let's keep going. We have a ton of questions from audience in the chat. And then of course, later we have our guest poet, Asiya. So if it's okay with you guys, we'll go with our first question from the username is Makupaj. I will ask to prompt your mic now so you can ask your question. Let's see. Okay, so we'll just move on to the next question until they are able to connect to their microphone. The next question comes from Prosper's iPhone. You should be able to activate your mic now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Michael and Prosper. I'm the same person. I'm just looking at the video on one screen and listening to everyone on the phone. I just wanted to ask if you're able to speak about vulnerability a little bit, like particularly with African American males, because there rarely seems to be a real place to express that in like the world, you know. I mean, so how does that come to play in terms of your paintings?
Yeah, I think that for me, I mean, I think it's a great question, and thank you for joining us today too. But obviously, I don't have a firsthand account in that experience. What I have is the account of my own family and people that I've come to know and love over time. And I always felt like, for example, I could have someone that I know quite intimately that was a poet, and I knew as being the most tender person in my entire world, but the way they presented externally was very different. And we would often talk about why they felt the need to kind of suppress their creativity or softness. And it was fear for them personally. And I think that there are many reasons why anybody connects to their own sense of intimacy, but the reality is we're all human beings. And for me, drawing the viewer in through kind of taking time, like the painting for me, it comes back to time. You have time to investigate, to slow down enough to really see the person and what's represented in front of you. Whereas if you were just in front of me saying hi and bye, I would probably, you know, people are accustomed to moving on to the next. It'd be like, hi, okay, bye. But there's something about painting that slows you down, that brings you into something that you might not see otherwise, which is why I love doing the interior work or representing people on the street, for example. It's just about bringing the viewer into time with someone. And with time, I think, comes intimacy and vulnerability hand in hand.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Jay Sebastian. Jay, I will ask you to unmute now.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. My question is, are there drawings made prior to the paintings? And if so, does that help pull the image together? And if not, how does that help you paint from the photographic reference without it?
That's a great question. So, because we are in the studio, I mean, this is kind of the perfect example in many ways. This is an example of the only drawing that occurs when I'm making the paintings. I don't necessarily do preliminary drawings in a sketchbook or on another sheet of paper. That to keep myself connected to the immediacy of painting from life and the more psychological space that I am attached to, I try to paint as quickly as possible. So I will do the sketch, like what you see here happened in one sitting, probably in maybe an hour and a half, where I'm looking at multiple images behind me, where I'll be kind of pushing and pulling from different images, building the composition out. And then once the sketch is done on the canvas, then that is my structure for the painting. I try to just remove as much second guessing as possible. And if I were sketching separately, I would just feel like I would overthink it. By nature, I'm a bit of a perfectionist and a control freak. So as much as I can like relinquish my desire to control something so that I can just connect to the most vulnerable and intimate part of myself as possible, then I think it's going to benefit the painting, which is why things sometimes are off or wonky, or, you know, I'm not, it's funny, painting is the only place where I'm not expecting perfectionism out of myself.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Henry. Henry, you should be able to activate your mic.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Henry.
Thank you for this. This is an amazing talk. I just was curious how the subjects have reacted to their portraits.
Great question. It is varied, but most of the time it's like a very emotional experience. So like the opening at the new museum was basically like a giant backyard barbecue where the space became transformed from like a formal art museum into a very like casual, celebratory, enthusiastic space where everyone who was in the paintings was just like being recognized left and right and were loving it and standing in front of their paintings, and they brought their family and friends. That for me, a part of my like, hello, my name is Jordan introduction when I'm meeting people is that I say, you're probably not going to be able to shake me whether you want to or not, because my hope is to keep coming back and to keep you involved in the life of this painting and involved for the long haul. So it is never just kind of like a one and done circumstance where I take the photograph and leave. That for me, a part of the community engagement aspect comes from consistency and being consistent with the people that I'm introducing myself to, and inviting them into spaces that they might not traditionally see themselves as being welcomed into. So for example, one of my students, Emmanuel, who could be in here and I don't even know, because oftentimes he texts me after these talks and he's like, great talk, professor. I'm like, I mean, but one of my students, Emmanuel, who is one of the represented figures in the painting at the new museum, told me about how when he came to the new museum, he was surprised because his security, somebody at the front desk like recognized him and shepherded him upstairs on their own accord, and how taken aback he was by that experience to be kind of approached and given a red carpet experience of a museum in a way that he's often felt that he has to become small within those environments. That every experience has been eye-opening, but generally speaking, I think people are overwhelmed by the opportunity to be cared for. You know, like it comes back to time that I think people are often taken aback by my willingness to see them, and then my willingness to take the time to make a painting of this scope, and my willingness to keep their families engaged and to stay engaged with them is kind of the best part for me. But generally speaking, people have been happy. I haven't had anybody be like, oh no, you're gonna have to burn that. So knock on wood, that never happens, but that hasn't happened yet.
Thank you so much. Okay, our next question comes from Zoe. Zoe had a couple of questions, so I'll prompt your mic now, Zoe.
Hi, thanks so much
Hi,
for
Zoe.
Hi. Thanks for
like
this
looking for everyone. I'm
conversation.
like,
I know. Zoom is awkward.
Yeah.
This has been so great, and thank you so much. I had a couple questions, but I'll just stick to one so that more folks can ask questions. I'm super curious to hear about, so there were a couple of paintings in the New Museum show in which the faces of the subjects were excluded. So either their backs were turned to the viewer or their faces were just cropped out. And I'm sort of curious to like how this act of, I don't know, excluding the face reckons with the questions of visibility and vulnerability and interiority that you're pointing to in your work. Yeah, just curious about that as a kind of compositional decision.
Great question, Zoe. And we didn't really talk about some of those works in the context of this, but the first time that I did something like that occurred after I made one of the large figurative paintings while I was in graduate school, where it was a painting of Devin, which is actually at the New Museum too. He's a purple figure where this like multicolored elephant is laying at his feet. And I thought that the relationship between his feet and the elephants could be a painting in and of themselves. I remember thinking like that part of the painting held me in a way that maybe other aspects of the painting didn't. And so I developed a certain curiosity around what it would look and feel like to bring intimacy to another level of viewing and the way that we engage with our environment or engage with just my hands. That when painting a full figure and somebody's looking out, there's a lot of responsibility and power that comes with that becomes it kind of distracts perhaps from my play of color and material and love and the abstraction within. Because I remember having a conversation with somebody who, it might have been Eric Mack, or there was somebody that came into my studio that said, like, these look like topographical maps. And I remember thinking like, whoa, like I'd never thought about that, but sections of the paintings themselves could be and inhabit a canvas all on their own. That there is the way that I'm using color and line tell a story themselves. So the practice evolved from me cropping that one image to coming to New York and being on the subway all the time and observing people's hands and the way that they held their bodies, or the relationship between their clothing in their hands or their clothing in their bag, or whatever it might be, that there were these elements of relationships between human and object that I was just drawn to. So I started making these crop paintings where the faces aren't included, or it's kind of zoomed in on just the hands, because those are instances where I'm not having an introduction and conversation with the people in the same way that I'm engaging the full kind of portrait sitter, that I'm going to them and saying, you know, I want you to be a part of this. There's a different kind of level of engagement. So out of respect and knowing that that process, although it is a part of this larger landscape narrative that I'm telling and engaging in, there's a different level of kind of consent, quite frankly. You know what I mean? Like, that's just the bottom line. There's a different level of people being aware. And the thing that I'm looking at isn't necessarily them looking back at me, because that very rarely happens on public transportation. We're all just like in our bubble praying that nobody does look at us. But it is about like how we hold ourselves within that space and how we are quite individualized even in the masses, and slowing myself down to observe that. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you, Zoe. Our next question I will read on behalf of audience member Stephen, which I will read now. The Marcus and Jace painting really moved me. I had a feeling a barbershop was their location too. However, one of the points in the piece that really strikes me are the shoes placed by the chair. Can you speak to that placement? What feelings it brought up for you, and maybe even the color choices of the shoes?
Yeah, so I think that's also a perfect example of the underpaintings, or the way that the drawing rests in the painting within its own rights, that I sort of allow this portion of the painting to also rest on its own. And some of that is about the eye traveling throughout the space, and thinking about how I can create a composition where there's a certain balance, and that I can also be, it's like comes back to confidence too. I was always deeply insecure about my ability to draw. I thought I couldn't draw. Everybody told me I couldn't draw. I wasn't formally trained in drawing. So like I would hide it through adding really thick layers of paint. And then there was a point where I was like, what? I'm not forget that. I can leave my drawing and the way that I draw is like just a part of my DNA as much as like the thickly applied portion of the painting. So those shoes, I remember really distinctly deciding to leave those shoes unpainted because I wanted you to notice them for the reasons that I've sort of laid out, that there's a pause in wondering why they're unpainted that allows you to see them in a way that you wouldn't notice if they were painted. But I love the fact that when I came in to photograph Marcus that day, it was towards the end of his shift. He's the owner of that barbershop. He recently had purchased it from the former owner. So he had stepped into this new kind of role. He had just had his second child. His son was with him at the shop. His son was asleep, curled up in that little kind of pea pod, and we couldn't get his son to wake up. And Marcus had his shoes off when I came in, and he was like, should I put my shoes? Like, he was like, it was clear he was exhausted. He was doing me a solid by letting me like come in and take this photograph, but he was eager to get home and like be done with the day. And he had already given me all those signals by taking off his shoes before I walked in the door. So when I was like, no, leave your shoes off, that's exactly what that is representative of, this moment where he was also comfortable in his place of business and blurring those lines between the public and private spaces and how we can occupy public spaces and find moments of intimacy or singularity within them. That it was a gesture for him of like, yeah, I'm in a state of repose, like I'm relaxed. Should I put these shoes on for this painting? I was like, you don't have to. He was like, cool, well, I don't want to. And then we tried waking up his son who wouldn't wake up. So I just said, put your arm around him, it's all right. So it's like one of my favorite moments in that painting, the tenderness and the way that he kind of holds his son without him necessarily knowing, and his safety within that.
Amazing. I love it. Thank you. Our next question comes from username Tootsie Warhol NY. I will prompt your mic now.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yep,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Hi, thank you guys, Catherine and Ashley and Jordan, for having this really great conversation. I guess my questions were related, and maybe Jordan and Ashley both want to weigh in on this, but it's, what advice do you have for emerging artists? And then for you personally, who do you go to for advice when you're navigating the tricky art world?
Ashley, I'll start, I guess, in some ways. The thing that I feel like I feel the most strongly about as advice to emerging artists or my students or anybody who's just like trying to be seen or be active in the art world, however they perceive that activity kind of happening for them, is that nothing happens without the work. It is hard to imagine at times that people will see you if you feel that you're making in isolation. But your commitment to your work is the first and foremost importance. That by the time someone comes around or a conversation occurs or somebody expresses curiosity, that they do that and you're capable and feeling confident, and there's real clarity to why you're doing what you do. That continuing to make with regard and regardless is of the utmost importance in whatever capacity you can, especially now where like I'm teaching students painting remotely and they're like, half of them are in their bathroom or in like a closet. Like it's wild, but some of the best work happens when pushing through kind of parameters that we see as being unbreakable. But our commitment to making it is always going to supersede the rest of it. And then what was the second part? Something else.
Who do you go to for advice?
Oh, everybody and their mama. I have no shame in asking questions. That is what got me through graduate school, because again, I kind of like showed up there and didn't really understand what was going on, but I had no shame in asking, what brush are you using? Why do you use that brush? Where do you go and get your painting supplies? Why do you go there versus Dick Blick? Or is Dick Blick better? Where do you order your stuff from? I'm like the queen of this is what community is for, and to suffer, again, just like suffer in silence or not know and like assume that you're asking a stupid question is just going to prevent you from the opportunity of knowing something that you wouldn't know otherwise. That we are, as a collective, our best resource. I go into my classroom teaching saying, I don't know anything. Don't look at me as the person who knows everything, because I don't. But what I can do is ask somebody who might know, and we can find the answers. Together, collectively, we will find answers to all the questions that emerge this semester. And that is the intent, is like learning how to seek answers and seek information to the questions that you might have. But genuinely, it's like, there is no, I ask my students questions, I ask my mother questions who doesn't know anything about the art world, I ask my friends from graduate school, I ask Ashley, it's everybody, you know, it's the doorman. I was talking to Jared the other day trying to get advice on something, like, who knows? It comes from everywhere, you know, like, can you look at this painting real quick? Like, I'm feeling comfortable about something. And he's like, yeah, like, this looks good. And I'm like, cool. You just ask everybody.
Yeah, I'll echo Jordan and connect the second question to the first, kind of, in that I do think that part of the advice I would give to emerging artists is to be in conversation. I loved your anecdote about Eric coming in and kind of noticing something, because on the flip side of the asking questions is being asked questions, and whether or not a question feels right for your practice, I think it ultimately builds toward clarification around the boundaries of your project, even if that means saying, I have nothing to do with what you are seeing in the work. And that's what I actually really like about studio visits, is that I'm a major question asker, because I love to just hear about the conceptual bounds of an artist to help think towards like what I'm looking at, and then also what might come to be. So I think having having people that you trust, and even those that you know a little bit less, to kind of come in at kind of periodic checkpoints to ensure that you're not completely in your head, even as making work is in many ways an individual endeavor. It's helpful to kind of break that open sometimes.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Jordan. Here's to asking questions. So now we will move to our poetry time. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending all of our events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Asiya Wadud to the stage. Asiya Wadud teaches poetry at St. Anne's School and leads an English conversation group for new immigrants at the Brooklyn Public Library. She is a member of the Belladonna Collaborative, a Lower Manhattan Cultural Council artist in residence, and a writer in residence at Dance Space Project. Asiya, I will prompt your mic now.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you today. And Ashley, Jordan, thank you so much for this conversation. It's given me so much to just think about and work with. And it's great to sit with your words from across the distance that we all find ourselves in now, somehow bringing us all back together. And thank you, Catherine and Hill Arts Foundation, for bringing us all together today. So I'm just going to read two poems. And I wanted to wear this sweater for you, but actually it's too hot. I have to take it off. Give me 1 second, please. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to read two poems to you. One poem, the first poem is written in conversation with Simone. It's written in conversation with Ade at the Guggenheim a couple of years ago. It was a Loophole of Retreat conference that Simone Lee convened in collaboration with Tina Campt and Saidiya Hartman. And I wrote this poem. It's kind of a record and memory of the day and all sorts of other things that found their way in. The order was in the hour of worship. The order was in the hour of worship. Stained glass windows act as mosaic, all radiant acts of attrition, all foregrounded, prayers supplanted, all prayers a back channel. Every pew held our bodies. We turned our bodies to the covenant, buttressed by the Mason-Dixon and all its flat border counties. God vested his attention along its northern border, vested his attention where he wanted, rested his attention along the crest. The only act of God was in the hour of our worship. The cross bore directives that could shower us as a trinity, shrouds of our own making. All exemplars prayers supplanted, all prayers supplementary work. The sun shone its piercing distance. It shone well because it wanted. The sun shone through the church pew. The sun shunted us along the back channel brood. The little tight crest began to peel at the seams. It began to peel back its seams. It began to gestate. Anything that has crossed my paths, I would mother. Any semblance of family elocution, I mother. All felt logic familiar, huddled for warmth in the space between us. That's what distance does to us. This gilded foremost endeavor, clenched in chlorophyll, wrapping tendrils toward the sun, at every breath my countenance. My long path to wholeness, no country can grant me that. My lonesome 3/5, the precise mathematics of partition, all across my selvage. Yesterday I sat with the ocean, seeking out its white noise, held a shell up to my ear, settled into its subterfuge. I took a sound recording of the waves, sound wave speculation, what's with the undercurrent, all these ocean grifters, what the flotsam water held in staunch relief. Yesterday I rose from my bed, Saturday morning, rode the ferry outbound, all New Amsterdam soundless current, a polyphonic noise system. No language was stayed. I broke with tradition. Hello, I called into a black vacuum. What I got was the virtuous salt sonic. What I got was a reply. Order comes to the house of worship. I slid my fingers through the hot sand. The sun burned my right leg, I let it. The planes, they flew overhead, I let them. The seagulls drifted outbound, let them. All birds a light when bruised, if their wings will carry them. Hello, I called into a vacuous island. From the bird's eye, we see the other islands. From the bird's eye, any light? From the bird's eye, pinprick? From the bird's eye, the sun was burning my leg, I let it. I counted 17 planes. I would triple that to count the gulls. I listened to the May ocean. I was still marooned in May. I was taking flight in May. I did my day as I wanted. I was still childless. I took my time to get to the ocean. I rode the ferry lengthwise. I love how its motor trilled, strumming us through its cerulean back channels. All prayer supplanted. Every pew held our bodies. When we got to the waters, all the oak pews faced the Atlantic to carry us outbound silk coffers, to sit with the words held in the pews. The sun burned a hole right through me, I let it. It was a better mean to supplant the missives. The pews got filled with our bodies, our linen garments cuffed by him by selvage, salt line and miasma, little grains of sand embedded, how the water ebbs and the tides bind. A few came with their long rods named birches, all the branches peeled back. The order was in the hour of the workhorse. The others were in the house of worship. Any small act delivers the Lord's vested ships. Next, we managed the heap, the lumber. We dressed our hands in the lumber gloves. We used the Granberg sawmill and its guiding system. We felled the trees and trusted they become lumber, wasted not a single splinter, all lumber cast from selvage. Diligently, the Bostrichidae emerged from their exit wounds, circular fissures in the wood's surface. We stowed inside them in ardent language. Undo the pestilence, smoke out the dense lattice, the dead rising right to the surface, or better yet, let them live. They built the ship's deck around us. We remained in the pews. We closed our eyes as a protective message. We cupped our hands to our ears, amplify any noise, direct conduit to any ocean. Under this pestilence, the ship's birth is coming together. During the long construction, we never rose from the pews. We knew the order was in the hour of worship. One by one, the timber became what it could become. When we opened our eyes, we were on the water. The Atlantic is the matriline. Wake, borehole, wave crest, lumber, cadence, incandescence, all prayers a back channel. Mason-Dixon bifurcated, split along Garrett County. We touched the boat to bless it, touched all its minor parts, touched anything unruly. Beyond 3/5 is the rest of Plessy. The order was in the hour of the workhorse. Doused our hands in mineral oil, we blessed it. This our finished vessel, so it would shunt us far from here. No map governed our journey. The nautical chart, a rote index of possible nexts. barren, void, electric language. No map yet governs us, thus no map governs our journey. The shrouds we tucked them in the hull, for whatever was coming, we were to live through it. For whatever was coming, we were to live with it. For whatever was coming, we were to live in it. We existed in the margins of the coda. We exited the ocean, all ovum rendered worthless, all ovum meritocratic, nothing else but progeny. No map yet governs us, thus no map governs our journey. I'm etching anything and whatever substance remains viscous. The workhorse brews to a full canter, all working hours held in accord, long hours than long life, countenance converge at wholeness, the numerator is filmy ocean, dividend the whole planet, all colonial demarcation, held in full credence, as if the earth existed just to suffer this pillage. The order was vested in the red moon. The order was in the hour of worship. How threadbare this trinity, selvage, brackish viscosity, Mason-Dixon covenant. The sun shines its full distance. It casts its gaze how it wants it. What it wants is the order of the workhorse. So what it gets is the order of the workhorse. And then I'll read you one more poem, and it's just a start. And there's some lines of things that were said just now. My mind makes for me a window, then a door. Makes for me marrow or an inside filament. Figment or sculpture, monument or inside cave. Slips of window panes, yawning at the seams. Or permanent fixture, green lathe or marrow or nested. An interior door ajar, though mesh, so more sieve than door. Nest of open windows does the mesh make without or with its handle. Adjudicated to meet the minute. A structured or strident city grid meets girth, meets exurb or elegy, Moses or forearm or minute or tide. The monument makes for me a relic or fixture, and plaque, gilded and scapula, evergreen aseptic gaps could the flowers make, their use spent or obsidian. My mange makes for me a dinner, softened inside any gilded mouth, a monument to marrow, what runs inside it. Oxygen to further a future, stovetop or otherwise, step inside or at the hem. My manager gathers the marriage of order or alliums, and almost in soft cells and tender and strident the window. My mind makes for me marrow or filigree, an intricacy delivered by the minute. The marrow creates and feeds a steady stream, a winter stream, silent or apparition, or the noise could speak, all brackish and woven, warp weft, and still life, each a degree of the apple. My mind makes for me a thin, tame vine, settling into its tangled rope, woven up inside the cavernous test tube, climbing up the facade, then inside through a pitched roof. What work, what worth? My mind makes for me a window, brushstroke, or way out, scraping back at the crumbles, door, or otherwise a fixture, or otherwise filmed fissure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asiya. That was beautiful and so powerful. And thank you to the Hill Art Foundation, again, for supporting today's conversation. Thank you, Jordan and Ashley. This was truly a wonderful way to start the week. And thank you again, everyone who tuned in today. This winter marks the Rails 20th anniversary. As a nonprofit dedicated to providing free and accessible criticism at events like the social environment, we're just asking that you would consider making a donation to our end of year campaign. Our goal is to raise $250,000 from over 500 people, doubling what we accomplished in our campaign last year. Thanks to the support from our community, and there will be a link in the chat with more info. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Alexander Dorobchevik and Shogakot Kazarian. And we'll conclude with a poetry reading from Alice Burdick. And you should all be able to activate your mics if you would like to say goodbye as you leave. Thank you again so much.
Bye, Jordan.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
Chris. Bye, Liz. Bye.
Thank
Thank you, guys.
you.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Jordan.
Bye.
Ashley.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you.
Wonderful,
Great.
Jordan.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
It was a great
Thank
call.
you, Fong.
Hey, Liz. I haven't seen you a while, so this is nice. Thank you so much.
Wow,
Good seeing
wonderful
you.
poetry reading. Thank you.
Oh,
That was
yeah, this is
amazing.
terrific. Jordan, you were brilliant.
Ashley. Thank
Ashley,
you,
so were you. This is for our archive, so it's fantastic, and I'm just happy that we have this chance to talk in greater depth of things. And yeah, I'm excited. I've seen the show twice already, so it's been a while to see the work, you know.
Yeah, truly.
God, I mean, it's since what? Since Yale days? When was that?
Yeah, it was at least, I think it was Yale days, like my first year. So 2012, 2013.
God, amazing.
It's
From
amazing.
there to the Sharp Lentas.
Yeah, that's right. Because then Sharp Lentas was right after Studio Museum, I think.
That's right. That's right. And just the growth is steady, and you gain so much stamina and confidence. So it's just beautiful to see.
Thank you, Fong. Truly, I really appreciate it.
All the support. Ashley, hello. Keep up the work, would you? Much
Ashley.
love and courage, you guys. This is our arsenal again. Bullshit politics. This is it. This is our arsenal. We'll keep it going, and we certainly deserve a delicious lunch ahead of us.
Yes.
Right, Chris? Liz?
Absolutely. We're coming over. Get ready.
Yes. Much love and courage, you guys.
All right, love you, Fong.
Bye.
Bye, you guys.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Jordan.
Flight.
Thank you. Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.